What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Jake Paul, 5 wins and 0 losses, taking on Anderson the Spider Silva, 3 wins and 1 loss. This is a professional boxing match scheduled for 8 rounds that's going to be taking place on October 29th. And this is the latest in the, we'll call it the Jake Paul experiment, where you go from having kind of a celebrity slash YouTube fighter in Jake Paul fighting another YouTuber. This is back in January of 2020, fighting Anderson Silva, and then stopping him, looking impressive, knocking Anderson Silva out in the first round, and then fight over fight, kind of having more and more of a wow factor as your level of opposition grows significantly every step along the way. You go from Anderson Silva, Nate Robinson, which that was a scary knockout, and that was the first one that was really a head turner that said, I don't know if Jake Paul could fight against any professional grade anything in terms of combat sports opponents, but he sure knocked the hell out of former NBA player Nate Robinson. And then he fought Ben Askren, a former, Bellator and 1 champion and an outstanding wrestler throughout his career. A collegiate, all-American, just all-world level wrestler who then went into MMA, was undefeated for most of his career. It wasn't until he transitioned into the UFC and got kneed by Jorge Masvidal that Ben Askren lost a combat sports fight. But he was not a striker. So in a boxing match, it's kind of like eliminating the one thing that would make a Ben Askren a threat in the cage. Well, he can't bring that with him into the boxing ring. And it turned out, he was pretty much inept in being able to deal with somebody who, if nothing else, has been training feverishly and developing their boxing skill set in Jake Paul. And Jake Paul made easy work of Ben Askren, knocking him out in the first round. And then he has the 2 fights with Tyron Woodley. The first being a close split decision win for Jake Paul, and then the second one being much more of a lackluster fight round over round until he uncorked that deadly right hand in the 6th round and totally put Tyron Woodley's lights out. Scary knockout. This knockout was a contender for a lot of people's boxing knockouts of the year. Granted, it was Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley, a former UFC welterweight in the UFC is 170-pound champion for several title defenses. Woodley is kind of seen as being a top 5 all-time 170-pounder in UFC history. Yes, he did have a long, 4-fight losing streak skid at the end of his MMA career, but Woodley was a very talented striker. I mean, the way that he won the belt was knocking out a knockout artist in Robbie Lawler. So this knockout of Tyron Woodley in the rematch, and again, the early rounds were kind of lackluster. It was really a snoozer. That knockout kind of saved the fight and kind of saved the Jake Paul hype train, so to speak. But yeah, him knocking out Tyron Woodley was a game changer in a lot of people's minds. And the only pivot from there is to, okay, now you've got to fight a professional boxer. Well, Anderson Silva, Jake Paul's opponent here, is not a professional boxer per se, but he does have a few professional boxing fights. And to his credit, in June of 2021, Anderson Silva beat a former middleweight boxing champion, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who, over the past several years has just kind of outdone himself in disappointing his fan base, basically disappointing any shred of, hey, maybe Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. can realize his physical potential. Now, you could argue that he already did that earlier in his career, although there were doubts over whether he was using PEDs. And, Chavez Jr. was always missing weight. It was one disappointment after the next. But he did have all the physical tools, had a great chin, had a lot of punching power. Granted, when he was at his best, he was fighting at 160. And in fighting Anderson Silva spent his MMA career fighting at 185 middleweight. Again, middleweight for UFC, 185. So Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. was smaller than Anderson Silva, but they were nearly even in height. We're talking maybe 6'1" against 6'2". And so, I thought Chavez Jr. was going to beat Anderson the Spider Silva, who I consider to be the greatest striker in MMA history, period. Anderson Silva changed the game. To me, he's one of the 2 greatest mixed martial artists of all time. It's a short list. It's basically him, John Jones, George St. Pierre, and then you could maybe include Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Some would include Fedor Emelianenko, Habib Nurmagomedov. But Anderson Silva changed the game when it came to MMA striking. Like, you weren't getting MMA fighters with the head movement and the intelligent counterpunching that Anderson Silva brought to the table. Just look at when Anderson Silva went up to 205 to take on former 205-pound champion Forrest Griffin, who beat Rampage Jackson and gave Rashad Evans, he lost his title to Rashad Evans, but Forrest Griffin was a very good MMA UFC fighter, and look at what Anderson Silva did to Forrest Griffin. He was just totally on another level when it came to MMA striking. So Anderson Silva, many of his fights were like must see because he has such creative ways of just dismantling and destroying his opposition. Like, look at the way that he caught James Irwin's kick and then hit him with the opposite hand and cut his eye open and finished James Irwin in that way. Or the way that he kind of made Forrest Griffin miss, and hit him off the back foot and dropped him 3 times with making Forrest Griffin, who was kind of coming in head over skis, making him miss, bing, and then just one knockdown after the next until I think the 3rd knockdown was it. But it was just a masterpiece performance. And Anderson Silva's career is just littered with these mastermind, brilliant performances. You know, from the way that he retained his title by pulling off the 5th round stoppage of Chael Sonnen, who was just taking him down to the ground and, just keeping him down, winning round after round. It looked like Chael Sonnen was going to cruise to a 5-round dominant decision win over Anderson Silva until in like the last minute and a half, Anderson Silva caught him in like a head and arm triangle, choked him out, and got the tap in the 5th round. Like, it was pretty incredible. One of the greatest kind of late pull a rabbit out of your hat victories this was a title fight. This was like a grudge match title fight. They had a rivalry going because of the amount of trash talk that Chael Sonnen brings. But yeah, Anderson Silva, and then the way that he front kicked Vitor Belfort in the face. So if there was a MMA striker who could give a boxer a legitimate problem, it would be somebody of the ilk of Anderson Silva. But Anderson Silva today is 47 years old. And yes, he did beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in summer of just last year, which again, in this whole like celebrity and crossover kind of, this other realm of pseudo boxing where you'll get like a Vitor Belfort to beat up a 50-something-year-old Evander Holyfield, I think that the most improbable and the most amazing thing that I've seen in this whole context was Anderson Silva's win over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And that is keeping in mind all of the, oh my God, Jake Paul just beat Tyron Woodley type of performances on the Jake Paul side. Just when I feel like Anderson Silva has nothing left to offer the fight game, he'll beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. with gloves on in a boxing ring, just doing nothing but jabbing, moving, and actually looking like a good boxer. Like, looking like he's got a solid base in fundamentals. And granted, he did do a little bit of boxing before going into MMA, so he's always kind of, kept his toe in the boxing game, but he didn't have like a boxing career. He had a few boxing fights, Anderson Silva did. But in the way that he ended his MMA career, losing 5 of his last 6 fights, I thought Anderson Silva was totally done. And not to mention the age, but just before he started losing, like getting knocked out by Chris Weidman, Anderson Silva was fighting like the Stephan Bonners and what is his name? Okami. And he would just drop both of his hands, stand in the pocket, right in striking range, with his hands down to his knees, and just move around. Just his trunk movement and his head movement was enough to draw a reaction out of his opponent, and then he would just drop him with like one punch, one after the next. It was so crazy, this magnificent middleweight championship run that Anderson Silva was on. I mean, it looked like you were watching a magician in the cage. So now that I'm sizing up Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva, where, Jake Paul, when he was getting the call to, fight a professional boxer for once, he's had multiple cancellations trying to make a fight with Tommy Fury, trying to make a fight with Hasim Rahman Jr. Now, granted, there was a bit of controversy because he was kind of making, or at least stipulating in the contract that Hasim Rahman Jr. had to like cut all the way down to a weight that he had never competed in. So I had reservations about that fight in the first place. I was actually going to go with Jake Paul probably via decision because I didn't think that Hasim Rahman Jr. would be able to perform well in the late rounds if he were to have made weight. So now Jake Paul is not only fighting a very good striker, but for once, now again, Anderson Silva isn't what you would consider to be a legit professional boxer. But Jake Paul, for once, is going to be fighting someone nearly his own size. One thing about Tyron Woodley, he competed at 170. One thing about Ben Askren, he competed at 170. One thing about Nate Robinson, he was a notoriously undersized NBA player who just had out-of-this-world athleticism that allowed him to win multiple slam dunk contests. Pretty incredible athlete, Nate Robinson. But Jake Paul is going to be fighting a fighter, like a striker, granted a 47-year-old striker, but again, what I consider to be the greatest striker in mixed martial arts history. Not in his prime or not anywhere near his prime, but it's still Anderson the Spider Silva. But, Silva, if you look at the face-off with Jake Paul and Anderson Silva, Silva looked like he was maybe an inch or two taller than Jake Paul, who's listed, I believe, at 6 foot flat, maybe 6'1". Yeah, listed at 6'1", supposedly has a reach of 76 inches. Anderson Silva has a reach of 77.5 inches. So Jake Paul, unlike anybody he's fought before, is going to have to get into range. And the one thing about Anderson Silva is that I've seen him fight a lot of his fights orthodox, and I've seen him fight southpaw. When he started the fight against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., he came out in a southpaw stance and fought majority of the fight as a southpaw. He can fight orthodox, but it looks like he might be just as effective from a boxing standpoint fighting from a southpaw stance. Jake Paul has yet to fight a southpaw, and again, this southpaw is going to be taller than him, rangier than him, and he's a very creative, tricky striker where, I saw Silva throwing, nice lead uppercuts against Julio Chavez Jr. He'll throw like a nice lead right hook, kind of like a sweeping, kind of a quick, given his age, a quick right hook, and then he'll kind of come in and throw like a long straight left. Now, I'm imagining Jake Paul's going to try to feint Anderson Silva out of position. One thing that I've seen Jake Paul try to do is he's been jabbing more and more. Like when he was fighting Ben Askren, he was jabbing to the body, but he was jabbing to the body to set up that big right hand up top. So he'll look low, he'll throw the jab low, he'll throw the right hand low, but he's doing all of this to set you up and get you to try to protect your body while he then goes high and puts your lights out, basically. That's what Jake Paul's been looking for. So I didn't see enough of that in this rematch with Tyron Woodley. Now, granted, he eventually set it up, and he was going to the body to set up that right hand. But there were a lot of rounds where I didn't really see him demonstratively winning the round against Woodley. It was almost like the inactivity was making these rounds like all swing rounds. Anderson Silva was winning rounds against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And if you were to ask me who would win between Jake Paul and Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., I would probably pick Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. So I know I'm doing a little bit of boxing math here where I'm illogically going, or I should say logically, but not always correctly saying, if fighter A beats fighter B and fighter B beats fighter C, then that should mean that fighter A beats fighter C, but it doesn't work that way because styles make fights. But again, I would choose Chavez Jr. to beat Jake Paul. As much improvement as Jake Paul has been showing in these recent years, and I'm convinced that he's committed to getting better and better. I think he's been training his butt off for the past few years now. I know Logan Paul's also been training, but I've always seen Jake Paul to be the more talented boxer of the two brothers. Now, they were both wrestlers. They were both, playing football. Logan Paul, I believe, was the better wrestler out of the two. But Jake Paul is looking like a pretty damn good boxer. And he's got, former boxer BJ Flores training him. And he's got other credentialed, incredible trainers working with him. Jake Paul has taken all the right steps to develop a fundamentally sound boxing skill set. He doesn't appear to be cutting corners. The only difference is that because of his star power and because of how he's marketed himself in this foray into boxing, he's been able to set up super fights while having a rookie pro level resume. Somebody who doesn't even have an amateur pedigree. Jake Paul's got one amateur fight. It's against Deji, KSI's brother. And he knocked Deji out, by the way, in the 5th round. A lot of people forget about that. Back in 2018, 2 years before Jake Paul's pro debut against Anderson Silva, he fought Deji in his only amateur fight. So Jake Paul, aside from his lack of amateur career, he's doing about everything you can do in terms of training to actually get good. And now he's fighting Anderson Silva. So, I think that he's going to have trouble getting inside on Silva. If you look at how Silva moved, especially in the first 3 rounds against Chavez Jr., you would have thought Anderson Silva was the pro boxer because of the way that he was flicking the jab out. And it's a long jab again. And then throwing those nice uppercuts, moving his head to avoid the bigger punches coming from Chavez Jr. and blocking hard right hands when Chavez Jr. really sits down. And again, Chavez has power. I think he's a harder puncher than Jake Paul. I know Jake Paul's naturally bigger, but again, I remember seeing Chavez Jr. hurt, longtime champion Sergio Martinez, and hurt, who was it, Andy Lee that he stopped? Although that one was kind of marred in controversy. Look up Emmanuel Stewart's, the legendary boxing trainer, Emmanuel Stewart's commentary and his opinion, his interview following Chavez Jr. and Andy Lee. Look that up. But Chavez Jr.'s got power, and Anderson Silva was blocking the punches intelligently, moving his head intelligently, moving around the ring with his legs, 47-year-old legs, intelligently, laterally. He was just looking like a fundamentally sound boxer. So I think Jake Paul's going to have some trouble winning rounds in the rounds that he doesn't hurt Anderson Silva. Is Jake Paul's jab, I know it's improving, but is it developed to the point where he's going to be able to win rounds against, again, somebody his own size and a legendary striker in Anderson Silva? Is Jake Paul going to be able to win rounds behind a jab without wobbling Anderson Silva? I kind of feel like it's going to be a little bit of feast or famine for Jake Paul. He's either going to knock Anderson Silva out, or he's going to lose either via decision or via stoppage. I can see Anderson Silva stopping Jake Paul. But what I think is going to happen is I just haven't seen Jake Paul be busy enough in the second half of fights. I've seen him throw hard. I've seen him knock Tyron Woodley out in the 6th round. But I haven't seen him pour on the volume. And I feel like he's going to have a significant amount of volume to beat Anderson Silva via decision. But I think Anderson Silva is going to be the round winner between these two guys. The question is Jake Paul going to land that right hand? I think he's going to maybe rock Anderson Silva, but I think Anderson Silva is intelligent enough to when he gets hit by a big shot to tie up. Look, if you were to have watched Ben Askren's career, Tyron Woodley's career, Anderson Silva's career, you would know that Anderson Silva is totally on a different planet in terms of just striking versatility and striking acumen. Now, again, Woodley, way better than Ben Askren as a striker. But Anderson Silva, again, he was a division up from Tyron Woodley, and he was like the greatest MMA striker. So you don't mistake one for the other. Anderson Silva is not Tyron Woodley. But we have seen Anderson Silva get knocked out by Chris Weidman, get stopped in his last MMA fight by Uriah Hall. So you might have some concern on Anderson Silva's chin and how that's going to hold up if he gets hit cleanly by that Jake Paul right hand. But just the way that I saw Anderson Silva intelligently moving his head and blocking. I think Anderson Silva has better head movement than Jake Paul does. I think Anderson Silva might have a better jab than Jake Paul has. And Anderson Silva is, again, a southpaw. So Jake Paul's going to have to be careful. I could see Anderson Silva, as Jake Paul is trying to set up the right hand, I could see Jake Paul walking into a hard left hand from Anderson Silva. I could see Anderson Silva switching stances and hitting and hurting Jake Paul with a right hand or with a lead left hand. I think, look, as good as the footage of Jake Paul working out is, I think Jake Paul's money signature punch is still going to be the right hand, and I think that Anderson Silva has more ways of hurting Jake Paul than Jake Paul has of hurting Anderson Silva. You know what? I'm going to go Anderson Silva here. I think this might be the bridge too far. And again, look, if Hasim Rahman wouldn't have had to sweat all the way down to that weight against Jake Paul, I would have gone Hasim Rahman. But I was going Jake Paul because of that contractually agreed upon weight. But here, where Paul and Silva are going to be fighting at a 187-pound catch weight, yeah, I'm going to go with the spider on this one. I'm going to go with Anderson Silva via decision. I'm kind of worried about this fight. I appreciate Jake Paul and what he's done. I appreciate the work that he's putting in. I appreciate how he's been able to not only market the fights brilliantly, but then get into the ring and then deliver dramatic knockouts, dominant performances, just when the lights are the brightest. And it's like, okay, to keep this money train going, you've got to perform here. And then he delivers a knockout or beats Woodley, edges a close decision after getting hurt in the middle rounds in that first 8-rounder. And this also is an 8-rounder, by the way. In that first fight against Tyron Woodley, Jake Paul, I think, had to dig deep to pull that decision off. And he's still going back to the gym and then working some more. I appreciate all of this. I just think that, you know, I don't know if I am ready. As a longtime Anderson Silva fan, I don't know if I'm ready to see Anderson Silva get knocked out by Jake Paul. I just don't know if my soul is ready for that yet. So this is this could be very dramatic. And odds-wise, this is super razor close, but Anderson Silva is a razor close favorite. Like, it's -115 to -105. So it's almost neck and neck, dead even. This is almost as dead even as the Clarissa Shields, Savannah Marshall odds were. Like, this, you don't get much closer than this Anderson Silva, Jake Paul betting-wise, which tells you that people are looking at this one like, I don't know, Jake. This is a big one. This is a tall order. And I think that Jake Paul chose such a dangerous opponent to make up for the multiple cancellations, like where Tommy Fury will pull out. And then, you know, he was replaced by Hasim Rahman Jr. And then that fell apart. So I think Jake Paul wanted to deliver big for the fans here. And he's really going for it. Yes, again, Anderson Silva is 47 years old, but props to Jake Paul for signing up for this one. I just don't think he is going to beat Anderson the Spider Silva. And if he does, hats off to him. I just want to be there to see it and to witness that. But yeah, let me know what you think about Jake Paul versus Anderson the Spider Silva in the comments. I know a lot of people don't like the celebrity fighting realm, this kind of sub-genre of boxing, but I at least appreciate the way that Jake Paul is going about it, and this is another significant step up in opponent. I know that it's not the pro boxer that we want to see Jake Paul fight, but yo, I don't know if Tommy Fury could beat Anderson Silva in a boxing ring. I don't know if Hasim Rahman Jr. could beat Anderson Silva in a boxing ring. I mean, maybe, but I don't know that. And again, I would have picked Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. to beat Jake Paul. And you know, if Jake Paul would have signed up to fight Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., I would have been like, damn, hats off to Jake Paul for that matchmaking, even though, you know, at his best, again, Chavez was a 160-pounder. But yeah, I respect the hell out of this chapter of the Jake Paul story. We'll see if this thing continues. Again, I'm going Anderson Silva via decision. I wouldn't be too surprised by a knockout either way here. But yeah, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.